There is a city underneath the city you are walking through right now. Not a metaphor, not a theory, a literal, physical city. Streets that were once at ground level are now basements. Buildings that once had facades facing open air are now buried behind walls of concrete and steel. Entire neighborhoods that were once the beating heart of Canadian life have been swallowed whole by decades of construction, redevelopment, and deliberate erasure. And the strange part? Most Canadians have no idea this happened. If you walk through downtown Montreal today, you're walking through one of the most sophisticated underground cities on Earth. Over 30 kilometers of tunnels connect hundreds of buildings, 10 metro stations, 2 bus terminals, and thousands of shops and restaurants. And 200,000 people pass through this network every single day, and most of them never think about what is above them, or what was there before any of it existed. If you drive through downtown Toronto, you pass glass towers that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build. You pass heritage designations on buildings that survived the wrecking ball. But you also pass, if you know what to look for, the faint outlines of a city that once stood exactly where those towers now rise. Shorelines that were moved, streets that were buried, entire communities that were paved over in the name of progress. If you visit the old town of Quebec City, you see something rare in Canada. You see a city that preserved itself, walls still standing, streets still following their original paths. Buildings that have survived 300 years of ice storms and politics and development pressure. Quebec City is the exception that proves the rule, because everywhere else in Canada, the original city is gone. This is the story of what was buried. This is the story of who built. On top of it, why they did it, and what Canada lost in the process. And this is the story of the people who have spent decades trying to dig it back up. To understand what was buried, you first have to understand what was there. When European settlers began building permanent structures in what would become Canada, they were not building on empty land. They were building on a continent that had been shaped by thousands of years of Indigenous occupation, trade, and architecture. The paths that became Canada's first roads were often Indigenous trails. The harbors that became Canada's first ports were often Indigenous fishing grounds. The high ground that became Canada's first defensive positions were often Indigenous gathering places. The French, arriving in the early 17th century along the St. Lawrence River, were the first Europeans to begin building in a serious permanent way. Samuel de Champlain established the settlement of Quebec in 1608, on a spot that had been a significant Algonquin site for generations. The location was strategic, a narrow point in the river where ships could be controlled, a high cliff that provided natural defense, and a valley below where trade could happen. Champlain did not choose this spot at random. He chose it because Indigenous people had already identified it as important. The architecture that followed was distinctly French. Stone construction, narrow lots, buildings pressed against each other in the European tradition. Streets that followed the logic of the terrain rather than any grid, the upper town on the cliffs, the lower town at the river's edge. A physical separation between the powerful and the commercial that would define Quebec City's character for centuries. But Quebec was the exception. Most of early Canada's architecture was wooden. Cheap, fast, easy to build. The settlers were not planning permanence. They were surviving. Log construction, simple frames, buildings that went up in weeks and could burn down in hours. This turned out to be important, because it meant that when fire came, and fire came constantly, there was almost nothing left to save. The fires that shaped Canadian architecture are not well remembered today. They should be. In 1734, Montreal burned, not just a few buildings, entire streets. The fire destroyed nearly half of the inhabited town, and what was rebuilt in the same wood that had just burned. In 1759, during the British siege of Quebec, the lower town was bombarded for months. Buildings that had stood for 150 years were reduced to rubble. The reconstruction that followed was British in character, overlaid on a French foundation. In 1825, the Miramichi fire in New Brunswick killed hundreds of people and burned over 2 million hectares of forest. The timber economy that had been the foundation of New Brunswick's prosperity collapsed overnight, and with it, the architectural ambitions of dozens of small towns. In 1845, Quebec City burned twice, and 2 major fires in the same year destroyed thousands of buildings in Faubourg Saint-Jean and Faubourg Saint-Roch, neighborhoods that had been the working-class heart of the city for generations. The government response was new building regulations requiring stone construction, but the regulations came too late for the buildings that were already ash. In 1849, Montreal burned again. The Parliament buildings were destroyed by an arsonist mob angry about political decisions. The rebellion losses. Bill had just been passed compensating people who had suffered losses during the rebellions of 1837 and 1838, and the Tory establishment of Montreal was furious. They burned the Parliament buildings and forced the government to relocate to Toronto and Quebec City on alternating years. The burning of those Parliament buildings was not just arson. It was the physical destruction of a moment in Canadian political history, and it changed the course of where Canada would build its capital. In 1904, Toronto's Great Fire burned for hours and destroyed over 100 buildings in the city's commercial core. The financial losses were staggering. The buildings that replaced them were built in a different style, in a different era, with different ambitions. The fire erased a generation of Victorian commercial architecture and replaced it with Edwardian grandeur. In 1917, the Halifax explosion destroyed 2 square kilometers of the city's north end, more completely than almost any natural disaster in Canadian history. The explosion, caused by the collision of 2 ships in the harbor, one loaded with wartime munitions, killed around 2,000 people and injured 9,000 more. An entire neighborhood, the Richmond district, essentially ceased to exist. What was rebuilt in its place was rebuilt in a hurry with government money, and it looked like it. Simple wooden houses, built fast, built cheap, built without the character of what had stood there before. Fire did not preserve Canadian architecture. Fire devoured it. But fire was only one of the forces working against the survival of Canada's early buildings. There was also ice. The climate that shapes Canada is not kind to architecture. The freeze-thaw cycle, water getting into stone and mortar, freezing, expanding, contracting, over and over for decades, is one of the most destructive forces a building can face. Stone that looks solid from the outside is often crumbling from within. A mortar that was mixed with slightly too much sand simply dissolves over the course of a century. Wood that was never properly treated rots from the foundation up. The buildings of early Canada were not built to last. They were built to work, to be useful for a generation, maybe 2. The idea that a building might stand for 100 years, or 200, or 300 was not part of the calculation. This is why European visitors to Canada in the 19th century were so often struck by the newness of everything. The buildings were not ancient. They were recent. Canada looked like a place that had just been built, because it had just been built. And the deep architectural layers that you find in a European city, medieval foundations under Renaissance facades, under Baroque additions, under Victorian renovations, simply did not exist here. What existed instead was a succession of pragmatic choices. Build what you need. If it falls down or burns down, build something else. Do not mourn what is gone. Move forward. This attitude served Canada well in some ways. It produced a culture of adaptability, of willingness to change, of comfort with the new. But it produced something else too, a culture that did not know how to grieve what it had lost, that did not know how to see the value in what was old, that was, in fact, almost constitutionally suspicious of anyone who suggested that old things might be worth keeping. When Confederation happened in 1867, Canada was a country that was simultaneously very old and very new. Very old in the sense that its French and British colonial foundations were already 250 years deep in some places. Very new in the sense that most of its territory was barely mapped, let alone settled. The Canadian government that took office in 1867 faced a staggering task. It had to connect a continent, administer a population spread over an area larger than any other country except Russia, and do it all with a small tax base and enormous competing regional interests. The solution, or at least a large part of it, was the railway. The Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885, is one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. It crossed mountains, bridged valleys, and stitched together a country that had no business being a single country at all. But the railway did something else too. It established which places in Canada would grow and which would shrink, which cities would flourish and which would be left behind. The cities that got railway stations became the cities that mattered. The cities that were bypassed shrank or died or became quiet backwaters, their early architecture preserved almost by accident, almost by neglect, because there was no money to tear it down and no reason to build anything new. And in the cities that got railway stations, something very specific happened to the architecture. The railways needed land, a lot of it. Land for tracks, land for switching yards, land for maintenance facilities, land for the grand stations that were meant to announce the importance of rail travel to anyone who arrived in a Canadian city. This land was often on the waterfront, because the waterfront was where the railways were laid, and the waterfront was also where the oldest parts of most Canadian cities were located. In Toronto, the railways took the waterfront. The industrial facilities that followed pushed the original shoreline of Lake Ontario further south, behind walls of fill and breakwater. The original shoreline of Toronto, the beach where Indigenous people had camped for thousands of years, where French traders had built their first structures, where the town of York had grown up in the late 18th century, is now inland. The actual water is hundreds of meters further south than it was when the city was founded. What happened to the buildings that were on that original shoreline? Some were demolished, some were moved, some were simply buried under the fill that was used to create new land. There are buildings from the early 19th century that are now underground, sealed beneath layers of soil and concrete, preserved accidentally in the airless dark. In Montreal, the railways transformed the area around the port in ways that are still visible today. Old Coutume Street, which was once one of Montreal's most important commercial thoroughfares, was gradually cut off from the waterfront by rail infrastructure. The buildings along it, stone buildings, some of them dating to the French regime, survived, but they were marooned, cut off from the economic activity that had given them their purpose. In Vancouver, the railways created the city almost from nothing. The decision to terminate the Canadian Pacific Railway at Burrard Inlet rather than at Port Moody, as originally planned, was made in 1884. Within a year, the settlement that would become Vancouver was being laid out. Within 2 years, it was a city. Within 3 years, it burned to the ground in the Great Vancouver Fire of 1886. Almost everything that was built before the fire was lost in it. What survived was so little that historians have to reconstruct Vancouver's earliest architectural history almost entirely from photographs and documents rather than physical buildings. Vancouver is one of the youngest major cities in Canada, and it looks like it. The architecture of its earliest years is almost entirely gone. The 20th century brought something new to the destruction of Canadian architecture: ideology. In the early part of the century, the ideology was improvement, progress, the belief that older things were inferior to newer things, that the proper direction of history was always forward, and that any city worth living in should look, new, modern, up to date. This belief was widespread throughout the Western world, but it had particular force in Canada, where there was always a slight anxiety about being perceived as colonial, as provincial, as behind the times. Canadian cities wanted to look like they belonged on the world stage. And to look like they belonged on the world stage, they wanted to look like they had been built recently. The result was a wave of demolitions in the early 20th century that targeted exactly the buildings that historians now most wish had been preserved. The mid-Victorian commercial buildings, the early institutional architecture, the working-class housing of the late 19th century. All of it came down, replaced by the stone and terracotta and pressed brick of the Edwardian era, which was then itself replaced by the glass and steel of the post-war era. In Montreal, the decade of the 1960s was particularly catastrophic. The construction of the metro system required enormous underground excavation, and the buildings above the metro routes came down in their hundreds. The construction of Place Ville-Marie, the cross-shaped skyscraper that became a symbol of modern Montreal, required the demolition of scores of Victorian commercial buildings. The construction of the highway network that still scars the city required the demolition of entire neighborhoods. The Dezoe neighborhood, just east of Old Montreal, was one of the oldest and most densely inhabited parts of the city. In the 1960s, it was demolished entirely to make way for the complex of modernist housing and civic buildings that now occupies the site. Thousands of people were displaced. Hundreds of buildings, some of them 200 years old, were destroyed. The neighborhood that had once been there, with its particular character, its particular streets, its particular relationship between buildings and public space, simply ceased to exist. The people who made these decisions were not villains. Most of them genuinely believed they were improving the city. The buildings they demolished were old, yes, but they were also often in poor condition. The neighborhoods they cleared were dense, yes, but they were also often overcrowded and underserviced. The modernist housing that replaced them offered indoor plumbing, central heating, and space, things that the old buildings had not always offered. But the trade-off was not just physical, it was cultural. The destruction of those neighborhoods did not just remove buildings. It removed the accumulated memory of the people who had lived in them, the street patterns that had evolved over generations, the sight lines and gathering places and informal public spaces that had made those neighborhoods livable in a way that the new developments never quite achieved. Let us talk specifically about what was buried in Canada's 3 largest cities. In Toronto, the story of buried architecture begins at the waterfront and moves inland over time. The original shoreline of Lake Ontario, as established by the lake itself before human intervention, ran roughly along what is now Front Street. The settlement of York, established in 1793 as the capital of Upper Canada, was built on this shoreline and the land immediately behind it. The first buildings of York were simple frame structures, military in character, built to serve the garrison that John Graves, Simcoe, established to defend the northern shore of the lake. These buildings are gone, not relocated, not repurposed, gone. The wooden structures of the 1790s had no chance against the combination of fire, decay, and deliberate demolition that characterized Toronto's development in the 19th century. What survived were not the buildings, but their footprints, the street patterns that Simcoe laid out, which still define downtown Toronto's grid in the older parts of the city. But the physical city did not stop at Front Street. The construction of the waterfront, the filling of the lake, the building of the harbor, the creation of what are now the Portlands, pushed the city south. The fill that was used to create new land came from somewhere, and some of it came from the demolition of existing buildings. When a building was torn down in downtown Toronto in the 19th or early 20th century, its rubble did not always go to a landfill. It sometimes went into the lake, becoming the foundation for new land. And this means that underneath the soil of Toronto's waterfront there are, literally, the remains of buildings that once stood in the city's core, not preserved in any meaningful way. Crushed, mixed, compacted. But there, the most dramatic example of buried Toronto is not on the waterfront, however. It is underneath the downtown core itself. Toronto sits on the edge of the Canadian Shield, but the city itself is built on clay and sand deposited by glacial. Lake Iroquois, the predecessor to Lake Ontario. This geology is relatively stable, which made it possible to build the Toronto subway system without the kinds of engineering nightmares that plagued other underground projects elsewhere in the world. But building the subway required digging, and digging through the oldest parts of the city meant digging through layers of history. When the Yonge Street subway was built in the late 1940s and opened in 1954, the construction encountered artifacts and structural remains from multiple periods of Toronto's history. Well casings from the 18th century, foundation stones from 19th century buildings, the wooden pipes of early water systems. These were documented imperfectly, often not at all, and most were simply removed and discarded. The subway stations themselves, some of them built in the 1950s and 1960s, displaced buildings and neighborhoods that are now entirely gone. The block that became the concourse of Union Station, itself a grand Beaux Arts structure from 1927 that was nearly demolished in the 1970s, was once occupied by a dense collection of Victorian commercial buildings, hotels, and boarding houses. Above the current subway, now on the streets of downtown Toronto, the layers of demolition and reconstruction are visible to anyone who knows what to look for. The narrow lots of the original town plan are still legible in the width of some buildings, the occasional stone foundation, visible in a basement renovation, the ghost of a doorway bricked over when a neighboring building was demolished. Toronto is not a city that has been archaeologically excavated. It is a city that has been practically excavated, dug up repeatedly, not for understanding, but for utility. And most of what was dug up was simply thrown away. Montreal is a different kind of buried city, where Toronto's layers are mostly inaccessible, hidden beneath functional infrastructure that nobody wants to dig up. Montreal's layers have occasionally surfaced in ways that have captured public attention and driven real archaeological effort. The story begins at Pointe-a-Calliere. In 1642, Paul de Chaumet de Maisonneuve led a group of French colonists to the island of Montreal and established the settlement of Ville-Marie at the confluence of the St. Lawrence and Little St. Pierre rivers. The site he chose was a low-lying point of land, a calliere in French, a term for a narrow projection of land, that had been used by Indigenous people as a trading and gathering site for generations. The first buildings of Ville-Marie were simple wooden structures, a fort, a chapel, a hospital established by Jean Mance that would become the Montreal General Hospital, one of the oldest continuously operating institutions in Canada. And these buildings were built on the ground surface of 1642, which was already several centimeters above the Indigenous occupation layers beneath it. Over the following decades, the settlement grew. Buildings were built, demolished, replaced. Streets were established. The Little St. Pierre River, which had once defined the western edge of the original settlement, was gradually filled in and built over. By the 19th century, it existed only as a covered sewer beneath the streets of Old Montreal. In the 1980s, when the city of Montreal began planning the archaeological museum that would eventually become the Pointe-a-Calliere Museum of Archaeology and History, excavations revealed something that stunned the archaeologists involved. Beneath the street surface of Place Royale, the oldest public square in Montreal, and arguably in Canada, was an unbroken sequence of occupation layers going back over 10,000 years. The most recent layers contained the remains of the original Fort de Ville-Marie, dating to the 1640s. Below that were traces of the fur trade era, a period when Indigenous and European people met and exchanged goods on this very spot. Below that were traces of Indigenous occupation predating European contact, fire pits, storage features, the evidence of seasonal camps that had been used repeatedly over thousands of years. The Little St. Pierre River had preserved these layers almost perfectly, because the river had been filled in gradually rather than excavated, and because the fill had created an airless environment that prevented the organic materials from decaying in the normal way. The archaeological record was extraordinary. Wooden structures from the 17th century were still partially intact. Leather goods, fabric, organic food remains, all of it still present, still readable. The museum that was built above these excavations is a remarkable institution. It is built literally over the archaeological site, with glass floors that look down into the excavated layers. Visitors walk through the present city while looking at the layers of past cities beneath their feet. It is a physical demonstration of everything this story is about, but Pointe-a-Calliere is the exception, not the rule. Most of Old Montreal was not excavated with archaeological care. It was dug up with steam shovels and dumped in trucks. The underground pedestrian network, the RESO, was built largely without archaeological supervision. The construction of Place Bonaventure in the 1960s, a massive multi-purpose complex that remains one of the largest buildings in Canada, required the demolition of the Bonaventure railway station and the excavation of an entire city block to a depth that would have revealed significant archaeological remains. Those remains were not systematically documented. The construction of the Ville-Marie Expressway, which cuts through the center of Montreal like a wound, required the demolition of hundreds of buildings in the Craig Street corridor, one of the oldest developed areas of the city. The buildings that came down included some of the oldest commercial structures remaining in Montreal. They were documented in photographs, some of them quite good photographs, but they were not preserved. What is buried under Montreal is not just one city, but many. The Indigenous occupation layers, the French regime, the British period, the Victorian commercial era, the early 20th century. Each layer built on the previous one, modified it, partially destroyed it, preserved it accidentally in basements, and filled in street levels, and bricked over windows. The underground city that Montrealers now use for shelter from winter is itself built on layers of underground history that most of its users never think about. In Vancouver, the story of buried architecture is different again, because Vancouver's timeline is compressed in a way that makes the layers more visible. Vancouver was incorporated as a city in 1886. Within weeks of its incorporation, it burned. The Great Vancouver Fire of June 13th, 1886, started in a pile of brush being cleared for railway right-of-way and spread rapidly through the wooden buildings of the new city. In less than an hour, the entire settlement was ash. What survived? Almost nothing. The Hastings Mill, store on the south shore of Burrard Inlet, was one of the only buildings in the area to escape the fire. It is now a museum relocated from its original site, preserved as a physical object, but disconnected from its original context. The city that was rebuilt after the fire was rebuilt in brick and stone as quickly as the materials could be shipped in. The buildings of the late 1880s and 1890s that rose from the ashes of 1886 were more substantial, more ambitious, more permanent looking than what had preceded them, and many of them survived. But surviving was not the same as being preserved. The expansion of Vancouver into the 20th century, and particularly the post-war expansion of the 1950s and 1960s, was driven by a belief in the supremacy of the automobile. The city was reshaped for cars. Freeways were planned and in some cases built. The downtown core was made more accessible to vehicles and less accessible to pedestrians. The neighborhoods that stood in the way of this vision were often demolished. The Hogan's Alley neighborhood, a black community that had established itself in Strathcona in the early 20th century, was destroyed in the 1960s and 1970s by the construction of the Georgia Viaduct. The community that had lived there, one of the few black communities in Vancouver at the time, was scattered. The buildings that had housed them were demolished. The cultural memory of that neighborhood was nearly erased. It has taken decades for the history of Hogan's Alley to be recovered, and that recovery has been largely driven by the descendants of the people who live there, who have fought to have their history acknowledged and memorialized. But the buildings are still gone. In Gastown, the oldest neighborhood in Vancouver, the survival of historic architecture has been more successful, but it has also been a story of near misses. In the late 1960s, the city of Vancouver had plans to demolish Gastown and replace it with a freeway interchange. The campaign to save Gastown was one of the first successful heritage preservation campaigns in Canadian history, and it saved an entire neighborhood from demolition. But saving Gastown also transformed it. And the neighborhood that had been preserved was renovated extensively, its original working-class character replaced by the tourist infrastructure that now defines it. The buildings survived, but the community that had inhabited them did not. The workers and immigrants and artists who had made Gastown their home were priced out by the renovation that was supposed to preserve the neighborhood. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the story of Canadian architectural heritage. Preservation for whom? The buildings survive, but not the life that gave them meaning. Underneath the streets of Canada's cities, there are things that have been forgotten. Some of them are documented. There are archaeological reports, filed in provincial archives and university libraries, that describe what was found when this road was built, or that foundation was dug. There are historical photographs taken by people who somehow knew that what they were looking at would soon be gone. There are newspaper accounts of demolitions, sometimes framed as celebrations of progress, sometimes framed as laments. But most of what has been buried is not documented. It is simply gone. The farmers who built barns in the 1840s and 1850s did not photograph them because photography was expensive and the barn was just a barn. When the barn fell down, or burned, or was replaced by something larger and more modern, nobody recorded what had been lost. The workers who built the CPR in the 1880s lived in camps that were entirely temporary by design. When the railway moved forward, the camps moved with it. The physical traces of those camps, the fire rings, the tent pegs, the garbage pits, the occasional tragic grave, were left behind on the landscape, unmarked and unmemorialized. The Indigenous communities that had occupied every part of what is now Canada for thousands of years before European contact left traces that are only now beginning to be documented systematically. Middens on the coast of British Columbia that are thousands of years old and contain irreplaceable information about the people who built them. Earthworks in the interior that are still not fully understood. Burial sites that were disturbed, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, in the course of building the country that now occupies their territory. The buried history of Canada is not just the history of European settlers. It is the history of everyone who has ever lived on this land. Let us talk about what was almost saved and wasn't. The Parliament buildings in Ottawa, the original centre block designed by Thomas Fuller and Chilian Jones and completed in 1876, was one of the finest examples of Gothic Revival architecture in North America. The towers, the carved stone, the intricate detailing of the facade, it was a building that announced Canada's ambitions and aspirations to anyone who saw it. On February 3rd, 1916, the center block burned. The fire started in the reading room and spread with terrifying speed through the wooden interiors and the complex roof lines of the Victorian structure. 7 people died. The building was a total loss. What remained was the Library of Parliament, SS, which survived because its iron doors were closed in time to stop the fire from spreading into it. The library still stands today, a Gothic Revival jewel that shows what the rest of the building looked like before the fire consumed it. The center block that was rebuilt after 1916 is the building that stands today. It is also Gothic Revival in style, also impressive in its scale and ambition, also very much a statement of Canadian national identity. But it is not the same building. The original, with its particular stonework and its particular proportions and its particular history, is gone. Or consider what happened to Montreal's Windsor Station. Windsor Station was built for the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1889, undesigned by Bruce Price in a Romanesque revival style that made it one of the most impressive railway stations in North America. The Great Hall, the stone arches, the towers. It was a building that commanded the western end of downtown Montreal with a confidence that railway companies once possessed. In the 1970s, with rail travel in decline and the property worth more as real estate than as a station, the CPR began making plans to demolish Windsor Station and develop the site. The campaign to save it was one of the most contentious heritage preservation battles in Canadian history. Architects, historians, and citizens argued passionately that the building was irreplaceable. The CPR argued that it was an economic liability. In the end, the building was saved. Windsor Station still stands, but it was saved in a form that its original architects would barely recognize. The Great Hall became a sports arena lobby. Office towers were built directly behind and above the historic structure. The station lost its railway function entirely. Saved, yes, but saved at a cost. The story of the Hotel Vancouver is a story about 3 buildings and 1 name. The first Hotel Vancouver opened in 1888 at the corner of Georgia and Granville Streets. It was a modest wooden structure, appropriate for the newly built city it served. In 1916, a second Hotel Vancouver opened on the same corner, a much grander structure designed in the chateauesque style that the CPR favored for its marquee properties. In 1939, a third Hotel Vancouver opened nearby, the massive French Renaissance pile that still stands today. What happened to the first 2 Hotel Vancouvers? The first was demolished when the second was built. The second was closed when the third opened and sat empty for years before being demolished in 1949. Each Hotel Vancouver buried its predecessor. This pattern of replacement, building a better version of the same thing and destroying the original in the process, is a defining feature of Canadian architectural history. Consider the many post offices that Canada's federal government built, replaced, and built again. The original post office in Toronto on King Street East was a handsome building from the 1830s. It was replaced by a larger post office in the 1870s. The 1870s post office was replaced by a much larger federal building in the 1930s. Each generation felt that the previous building was inadequate for the city's needs. Each generation was right. Each generation was also wrong. The need to serve more people, to handle more mail, to project more authority, these were real needs, but they were served at the cost of the accumulated architectural history of the site. The buried cities of Canada are not only in the ground, some of them are in the air. Upper floors of downtown buildings, sealed off and unused for decades. Attic spaces above Victorian commercial blocks, their original painted advertisements still visible on the interior walls. Roofscapes of buildings that have been so thoroughly remodeled at street level that the only evidence of their original character is visible from above, where the changed cornice work or the different brick bond reveals what was once there. In Halifax, on the buildings of the North End that survived the 1917 explosion have been so thoroughly renovated over the past century that almost nothing of their original appearance is visible from the street. But in some of them, the original construction is still visible in the basement. The stone foundations and heavy timber framing of 19th century Halifax preserved in the darkness below street level. In St. John, New Brunswick, the Great Fire of 1877 destroyed most of the city and was followed by a rapid reconstruction in brick and stone. The rebuilt city of the 1870s and 1880s has survived remarkably well in the uptown area, making St. John one of the best preserved examples of post-fire Victorian commercial architecture in North America. But the city that existed before the fire of 1877, older, more diverse in character, more organically evolved, is almost entirely gone. In Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, the scale of the city and the relatively slow pace of development in the 20th century combined to preserve an unusual amount of 19th century architecture. Walking through parts of Charlottetown today is as close as you can get in Canada to experiencing the physical character of a mid-Victorian city. But even here, the losses have been significant. The original wooden buildings of the early settlement, the Georgian facades that were covered over or replaced by Italianate renovations, the ordinary working-class housing of the 19th century, which has been almost entirely demolished because it was not considered worth preserving. The archaeology of ordinary life is often the first thing that gets lost. The grand buildings, the government offices, the churches, the railway stations, the banks, these are the ones that preservationists fight to save. And sometimes they succeed, but the ordinary buildings, the ones where ordinary people lived and worked and raised their families, these are the ones that disappear without ceremony. The boarding houses of 19th century Montreal, where immigrant workers from Ireland and Scotland and later from Eastern Europe and Asia crowded into small rooms and worked long hours in the factories and workshops below. These are gone. The wooden tenements of Toronto's Cabbagetown neighborhood, where Irish Catholic workers built their community in the decades after the famine, most of them are gone. The fishing shacks of Nova Scotia's small harbors, where generations of families lived in close proximity to the sea that gave them their living, almost all of them are gone. What survives in memory is often distorted. The grand buildings that have been preserved tell a story about Canada's aspirations and achievements. They do not always tell a story about how most people actually lived. The archaeology that has been done in Canada's cities in recent decades has tried to correct this distortion. Excavations in Montreal have recovered the physical remains of the working-class neighborhoods that were demolished in the 1960s and 1970s, providing information about diet, health, material culture, and daily life that no document could have provided. Excavations in Toronto have recovered similar information about the working-class communities of the 19th century. But these excavations are expensive and time-consuming, and they cannot always be done before the bulldozers arrive. The development timelines of 21st century Canada are not set by the pace of archaeological investigation. They are set by the pace of capital. There is a place in Ontario where the buried architecture is visible in a way that is almost miraculous. The town of Port Hope sits on the north shore of Lake Ontario, about 2 hours east of Toronto. It was settled in the late 18th century and developed into a prosperous commercial center in the mid-19th century, serving the agricultural hinterland of the surrounding counties. The arrival of the railway in the 1850s and 1860s consolidated its importance, and the town built. Accordingly, then the railway age ended, and Port Hope did not grow. It did not need to demolish its Victorian commercial core to make way for larger buildings, because larger buildings were not being built. It did not need to clear its residential neighborhoods for parking lots and drive-thrus, because the commercial activity that would have required those things was not happening. Port Hope is, as a result, one of the best preserved examples of Victorian small-town commercial architecture in Ontario. Walking down Walton Street, the main commercial street, is like walking through a 19th century streetscape that somehow survived into the present. The proportions are Victorian, the building heights are Victorian, even the relationship between the street and the storefronts is Victorian. Narrow lots, buildings pressed together, upper floors used for apartments or offices. This survival was not the result of a preservation campaign or a planning policy. It was the result of economic stagnation. Port Hope survived because it was too small and too economically marginal to attract the development that would have destroyed it. This is a paradox at the heart of Canadian architectural preservation. The places that preserve their architecture are often the places that failed economically. The places that succeeded, that grew, that attracted investment, that built their way into the modern era, are the places that demolish the most. Let us follow the money. In the 1950s and 1960s, the federal government of Canada began a series of urban renewal programs that would reshape the physical character of every major Canadian city. These programs, modeled on similar initiatives in the United States, were premised on the idea that the physical environment of cities needed to be modernized to address social problems. Poverty, crime, health issues, overcrowding, all of these were understood in the language of the era as products of the physical environment. Old buildings caused poverty, old streets caused crime, old neighborhoods caused disease. The solution was to clear the old and replace it with the new. The neighborhoods that were targeted for urban renewal were almost always working class and immigrant neighborhoods where visible poverty made the case for intervention easy to make. The wealthy neighborhoods were left alone. The heritage buildings in the wealthy neighborhoods were often preserved or renovated. The ordinary buildings in the poor neighborhoods were demolished. In Winnipeg, the North End neighborhood had been the heart of the city's immigrant community since the late 19th century. Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, Germans, Scandinavians, all of the people who had come to the prairies in the great immigration wave of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had passed through the North End, and many had stayed. The neighborhood had a physical character that reflected this history. Orthodox churches with onion domes, Jewish commercial establishments, Ukrainian community halls, modest wooden houses with elaborate gardens. In the 1950s and 1960s, urban renewal cleared large sections of the North End, replacing the original housing with public housing towers that were already obsolete in design when they were built and that have since been demolished themselves, leaving only vacant land. In Halifax, at the Africville neighborhood was one of the most egregious examples of urban renewal in Canadian history. Africville was a black community that had existed on the shores of the Bedford Basin since the early 19th century. The people who lived there were descendants of black loyalists and escaped slaves, and they had built their community over generations, establishing churches, schools, and a social network that was the foundation of black life in Halifax. In the 1960s, the city of Halifax decided that the land Africville occupied was needed for industrial development. The community was demolished. The residents were offered relocation assistance that was, by any standard, inadequate. The church that had been the center of community life was demolished. The homes, the schools, the physical evidence of generations of black life in Halifax, all of it was removed. The city of Halifax formally apologized for the demolition of Africville in 2010. The apology included a commitment to build a replica of the Seaview United Baptist Church on or near the original site. A replica of a building is not the building. An apology for the destruction of a community is not the restoration of the community. The people who lived in Africville knew what they had lost. It has taken the rest of Canada decades to begin to understand it. The story of what Canada built on top of its original architecture is not complete without acknowledging what was there before the Europeans arrived. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes called the Iroquois, sometimes called the Six Nations, had a tradition of building that created permanent settlements of a scale and sophistication that Europeans were slow to acknowledge. The longhouses that were the primary dwelling unit of Haudenosaunee communities were not simple shelters. They were sophisticated structures, up to 100 meters in length, housing multiple families in a social arrangement that was both practical and culturally meaningful. The Haudenosaunee built their settlements with intention, relating them to each other and to the landscape in ways that reflected their political and spiritual values. The Iroquoian village sites that have been excavated in Ontario and Quebec reveal communities that were carefully planned and efficiently organized, with sophisticated systems for food production, waste management, and community life. When Europeans arrived, they often misread these communities. They saw bark-covered longhouses and interpreted them as primitive. They did not see, or chose not to see, the sophisticated social and economic systems that the architecture expressed. They certainly did not see the deep relationship between the built environment and the cultural values of the people who created it. The displacement of Indigenous communities from their traditional territories in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was not just the displacement of people, it was the displacement of architecture. The villages that had been occupied for generations were abandoned. In some cases, they were deliberately destroyed by colonial forces who understood that destroying a village was a way of destroying a community's sense of home and identity. The Haudenosaunee village of Onondaga was burned by a colonial military expedition in 1779. The villages of the Mohawk Valley were systematically destroyed in the same campaign. These were not just military targets, they were the physical embodiment of communities that had existed for centuries. The physical traces of these villages, the earthworks, the post molds where longhouse posts once stood, the midden deposits, are still present in the landscape of Ontario and New York State. They are, in a literal sense, the buried architecture of Canada's original inhabitants. In British Columbia, the story of buried Indigenous architecture takes a different form. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest Coast, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, the Heiltsuk, the Kwakwaka'wakw, and many others, built in cedar, a wood that resists decay far better than the hardwoods of eastern North America. Their architectural tradition produced structures of extraordinary scale and ambition, plank houses that could be 20 meters long and house multiple families, raised on posts and decorated with carved and painted designs that encoded cultural and spiritual information. The totem poles that are the most recognizable element of this architectural tradition are not merely decorative objects. They are historical documents recording the lineages, achievements, and relationships of the families that commissioned them. They were placed at the fronts of houses, serving as both entrance markers and public statements of identity. When the residential school system was established in the late 19th century, it targeted this tradition directly, and Indigenous children were removed from their communities, forbidden to speak their languages, and taught to see their cultural practices as inferior. The totem poles and plank houses that remained in their home communities were not maintained in the traditional way because the people who knew how to maintain them were often not there. In many coastal communities, the traditional buildings and poles that had been the physical expression of the culture gradually deteriorated. The cedar, which would have been maintained in the normal course of life, was not maintained. Buildings collapsed. Poles fell. The missionaries and government officials who witnessed this process often interpreted it as evidence of cultural decline. It was, in fact, evidence of the damage that the residential school system and the related policy of cultural suppression had done to living communities. The buildings were not declining because the culture was dying. The buildings were declining because the people who would have maintained them had been removed from their communities by force. Some of those poles were collected by museums, where they were preserved as artifacts but stripped of their context. Many were left to collapse in place, where they have since been consumed by the force that their builders had worked so hard to hold at bay. The recovery of what was buried has been slow, uneven, and incomplete. The heritage preservation movement in Canada began in a serious way in the 1970s in response to the destruction of the 1960s. The demolition of Bonaventure Station in Montreal, on the near demolition of Windsor Station, the destruction of entire neighborhoods for freeways and housing projects, all of these galvanized a generation of Canadians who could see that something irreplaceable was being lost. The movement achieved real things. Heritage designation laws were passed in most provinces. Federal programs were established to support the preservation of historic buildings. Organizations like Heritage Canada, now the National Trust for Canada, built the institutional infrastructure needed to make the preservation argument effectively. The built heritage of Canada, or at least a part of it, began to be systematically protected. But preservation is not the same as restoration, and restoration is not the same as resurrection. The buildings that were saved in the 1970s and 1980s were often saved in compromised form. Facades preserved while interiors were gutted. Ground floors converted to retail use, while upper floors were sealed off as storage. Original mechanical systems replaced with modern ones that changed the character of the interior. The problem was money. Preserving a historic building is expensive. Maintaining a historic building is expensive. Adapting a historic building to modern use, to modern fire codes, to modern accessibility, requirements, to modern energy standards, is very expensive. For most owners of historic buildings, the math did not work. The cost of preservation exceeded the economic return. The government programs that were meant to help were often underfunded, overlapping, and inconsistent. A building that qualified for federal heritage designation might not qualify for provincial tax credits. A building that received municipal heritage designation might still be at risk of demolition because the heritage status did not actually prevent an owner from applying to demolish it. The heritage designation system in Canada, in most provinces, is not a protection system. It is a notification system. It tells you that something has been identified as having heritage value. It does not, in most cases, prevent the destruction of that thing. There are exceptions. Quebec has some of the strongest heritage protection laws in Canada, and the result is visible in the landscape. Old Quebec City and Old Montreal are protected in ways that have prevented the kind of wholesale demolition that happened elsewhere. The built character of these places is genuinely historic, not just preserved looking. But even in Quebec, the story is not entirely positive. The protection that has been afforded to the grand public buildings and the tourist-friendly historic districts has not always been extended to the ordinary buildings where ordinary people lived. The industrial heritage of Montreal, the factories and warehouses and canal infrastructure that drove the city's 19th century economy, has only recently begun to receive serious attention, and much of it is already gone. The Lachine Canal, which connected Montreal to the Great Lakes and was the engine of the city's industrial development in the 19th century, was closed to commercial traffic in 1970. The canal itself survived, and eventually being restored as a recreational waterway and National Historic Site. But the industrial buildings that lined it, the grain elevators, the flour mills, the textile factories, were mostly demolished in the years after the canal closed. The mills that had employed thousands of workers in the 19th century, the factories that had made Montreal the industrial capital of Canada, are largely gone. What replaced them? In some cases, nothing. In other cases, condominiums. The transformation of industrial heritage into residential real estate is one of the defining urban stories of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Old factories become loft apartments. Old warehouses become mixed-use developments. Old grain elevators, in Winnipeg, in Vancouver, in Montreal, become boutique hotels or cultural centers. This transformation preserves the shell of the building while replacing its content and its meaning. The worker who spent her life in the mill does not live in the loft that is built in its shell. The grain elevator that was the economic heart of the prairie wheat economy does not serve that economy when it becomes a boutique hotel. The physical structure survives. The social meaning does not. There are places in Canada where the buried architecture is still being discovered. In 2015, construction work in downtown Halifax uncovered the remains of a 19th century privy, an outdoor toilet essentially, that contained a remarkable collection of artifacts. Bottles, ceramics, leather goods, and other everyday objects from the 1860s and 1870s had been deposited in the privy over the years and had been preserved by the airless conditions underground. The artifacts told a story about daily life in mid-Victorian Halifax that no document could have told. The medicine bottles indicated health concerns and medical practices. The ceramic patterns indicated the economic status of the households that used them. The food remains indicated what people were eating and how they were preparing their food. This is what archaeology can do for our understanding of the past. Provide access to the material evidence of daily life that documents and photographs miss. The grand decisions of politicians and generals are well documented. The daily lives of ordinary people are not. In 2019, construction work in downtown Toronto uncovered the remains of what appeared to be an early 19th century structure near the original shoreline of Lake Ontario. The artifact assemblage was consistent with occupation in the 1810s or 1820s, a period when York was still a small garrison town on the edge of a wilderness that few Europeans had penetrated very far. The discovery required the construction project to pause while archaeologists documented the site. The documentation took weeks. The construction then resumed, and the remains were removed. This is the standard outcome. Discovery, documentation, removal. The artifacts go to storage in a laboratory or museum. The site is destroyed. The building that was uncovered goes back into the earth, in fragments this time, documented but not preserved. There is a different way to think about this. The cities of Canada are not just the cities that exist today. They are the accumulation of all the cities that have ever existed in the same places. The ground beneath downtown Montreal is saturated with history, not just the history of one city, but of many, going back thousands of years. The same is true of downtown Toronto, of downtown Vancouver, of every city in Canada that has been continuously occupied for any length of time. This accumulated history is a resource. It is a form of wealth that cannot be replaced once it is gone. The artifacts in the ground, the building foundations, the refuse deposits, the structural remains, contain information about how people lived, what they valued, how they understood their world, that cannot be extracted from any document or reconstructed from any description. When we destroy that information in the course of development, we are making a choice. We are choosing the value of the new building over the value of the information in the ground. Sometimes that is the right choice. The new building may serve needs that are more pressing than the historical record it displaces. But it should be a conscious choice, made with full awareness of what is being lost. Too often in Canada, it has not been a conscious choice. It has been an accidental one. The development happens, the ground is disturbed, the history is destroyed, and nobody stops to ask whether there was another way. The people who have tried to change this are worth knowing. So Eric Arthur was a professor of architecture at the University of Toronto, who began documenting Ontario's architectural heritage in the 1930s and continued for decades. His book, Toronto, No Mean City, first published in 1964, was one of the first serious attempts to document and celebrate the architectural history of a Canadian city, and it came out just in time to witness the destruction of many of the buildings it celebrated. Arthur was not just a documenter, he was an advocate. He argued, loudly and repeatedly, that the buildings of Canada's past were worth preserving, that they told a story that could not be told in any other way, and that the country was impoverishing itself by destroying them. He was often not listened to, but he changed the conversation, and the people who changed the policies in the 1970s were often people who had been influenced by his work. Phyllis Lambert is another figure who deserves to be better known. A Montreal architect and heir to the Seagram fortune, Lambert dedicated much of her life to the preservation of Montreal's built heritage. She founded the Canadian Centre for Architecture in 1979, an institution that is both a museum and a research center dedicated to the study and preservation of architectural heritage. The CCA has done more to advance the understanding of Canadian architecture, both contemporary and historical, than any other institution in the country. Lambert was also one of the people most responsible for saving Old Montreal. In the 1960s, when development pressure on the area was intense and the city government was receptive to proposals to demolish the historic buildings and replace them with something more modern, Lambert led the campaign to have the area designated a historic district. The designation did not save everything, but it saved enough to make Old Montreal what it is today, one of the most authentically preserved historic neighborhoods in North America. The Indigenous communities of Canada have their own relationship to buried architecture, and it is one that mainstream Canadian society is only beginning to understand. For many Indigenous nations, the concept of buried or abandoned architectural sites is not simply a matter of historical interest. These sites are spiritually significant. They are places where ancestors lived and worked and died. They are connected in ways that are not easily translatable into the language of Western heritage management to the living communities that are descended from the people who built them. When an archaeological site is excavated without the consent and involvement of the relevant Indigenous community, it is not just a methodological failure. It is a violation of the relationship that Indigenous people have with their ancestors and with the land. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which published its final report in 2015, identified the recognition and protection of Indigenous cultural heritage as a priority for reconciliation. The recommendations of the TRC have begun to change practice in archaeology and heritage management in Canada, but the change is still incomplete. In British Columbia, First Nations communities are increasingly involved in the management of archaeological sites on their traditional territories. In some cases, they have taken over direct control of this management, developing their own protocols and standards for how sites should be investigated and protected. In other cases, they are working in partnership with provincial heritage agencies to develop approaches that respect both Western scientific standards and Indigenous values. This is a significant shift. For most of the history of archaeology in Canada, the voices of Indigenous people about their own ancestral sites were not heard. The excavators arrived, dug up the evidence of past occupation, wrote their reports, published their findings, and left. The communities whose history was being excavated were not part of the conversation. And that is changing. The change is slow, and it is still contested in some quarters, but it is real. Let us return to the underground. The underground pedestrian networks of Canadian cities are a specific kind of buried architecture, or more precisely, a kind of architecture that buries itself. Montreal's RESO is the most extensive, but it is not the only one. Toronto has PATH, a 30-kilometer network of tunnels and walkways connecting the downtown core. Calgary has a +15 network of elevated walkways. Edmonton has Piedway system. Winnipeg has a network that connects several downtown buildings. These networks were built to deal with the Canadian climate. When temperatures drop to -20 or -30, and when wind and snow make outdoor movement genuinely dangerous, the ability to move between buildings without going outside is not a luxury, it is a practical necessity. But these networks have had an effect on the urban landscape above them that was not always intended or foreseen. By making it possible to move between downtown buildings without using the street, the underground networks have reduced the foot traffic on the streets above them. Businesses that depend on street-level pedestrian traffic have struggled in neighborhoods where the underground network pulls customers inside and underground. Streets that were once animated by pedestrian activity have become quiet and sometimes desolate. In Montreal, the relationship between the underground city and the street-level city is complex and contested. Some areas of downtown Montreal, above the Réseau, are vibrant and active, and others are essentially dead at street level because everything happens below. The Réseau itself has its own architectural character, a character that is notably different from the character of the streets above it. The underground world is climate-controlled, well-lit, and oriented to retail. It is also somewhat disorienting in that it does not present the user with the landmarks and sight lines that help people navigate the city above ground. Moving through the Réseau requires either prior knowledge of the system or a willingness to follow the signs, which are not always perfectly legible. The underground city is a city built for survival. The city above it is a city built for life. The relationship between the two is one of the central tensions of urban design in Canada. There is one more buried city that deserves extended attention, and it is one that is not beneath any of Canada's major urban centers. The town of Dunwich in Ontario's Elgin County sits on the north shore of Lake Erie. It was established in the early 19th century and had a brief period of prosperity as a port town serving the agricultural hinterland to the north. But the lake is eating it. Lake Erie is not stable. The north shore of the lake is composed of soft glacial clay that erodes rapidly under the assault of waves and ice. The rate of erosion is measured not in centimeters per year, but in meters per year in some places. The original shoreline of Dunwich was several hundred meters further into the lake than the current shoreline. What was there? Houses, streets, stores, churches. The entire commercial and residential core of the original town of Dunwich has fallen into the lake over the past 2 centuries. The archaeology is happening in real time as the lake continues to cut into the clay and expose briefly the foundations and artifacts of the lost town before carrying them out into deeper water. Dunwich is not the only Canadian town that is being consumed by water. The coastal communities of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are facing rising sea levels that are accelerating the erosion of shorelines that were already retreating. The low-lying areas of Prince Edward Island are particularly vulnerable. Entire sections of the island's north shore have been lost in living memory, and the rate of loss is accelerating. The buried architecture of these communities is not buried in the ground. It is buried underwater, or it is falling into the water right now. The buildings of Canada's coastal communities are disappearing in a way that is both very slow and very fast. Slow in geological terms, fast in human terms. Climate change is accelerating this process, and it is creating a new form of buried architecture, the buildings that will be underwater by the end of this century, buildings that exist today, that people live and work in today, but that will be gone within the lifetimes of people who are currently children. What does it mean to lose architecture? It means more than losing buildings. Buildings are containers. They contain people, activities, memories, relationships. When a building is lost, the container is broken, and the things it contained are scattered. The community that lived in a neighborhood for generations does not simply relocate and continue. The relationships that were built on proximity, the ability to knock on a neighbor's door, to see the same faces on the street, to share the physical experience of a particular place, these are disrupted by displacement, often permanently. The social infrastructure of community is built on the physical infrastructure of neighborhood, and when the physical infrastructure is destroyed, the social infrastructure suffers. The evidence for this is not just theoretical. The research on urban renewal in Canada and the United States consistently shows that the communities that were displaced by mid-20th century development programs did not thrive after displacement. The new housing that replaced the old was often of lower quality, and despite its modernity. The social networks that had developed in the old neighborhoods were severed and never fully reestablished. The architecture wasn't the only thing that was lost. The people lost something too. And yet, there is a tendency in discussions of this kind to become elegiac, to treat everything that was lost as something that was better than what replaced it, to assume that preservation is always the right answer and demolition is always the wrong one. This is not true. Some of what Canada demolished needed to be demolished. The slum housing of the 19th century, the overcrowded tenements where tuberculosis and typhoid and cholera killed thousands, the buildings that were structurally dangerous and thermally inadequate and sanitation-free. These buildings were not romantic. They were not worth preserving. The people who lived in them did not want to live in them. They wanted better. The desire to build new cities on top of old ones was not simply greed or ignorance or disrespect for the past. It was also a genuine desire for improvement. The architects and planners of the 20th century who cleared the slums and built the housing projects were, many of them, acting from a sincere belief that they were making the world better. They were wrong about many things. They were wrong about the value of the architectural heritage they destroyed. They were wrong about the social networks they disrupted. They were wrong about the human scale of the environments they replaced the old ones with. But they were not wrong about the desire to improve conditions for people who were suffering. The lesson of Canadian architectural history is not simply that demolition is bad. The lesson is that demolition without understanding is bad, that replacing without thinking is bad, that progress without memory is bad. The cities that have done best are the cities that figured out how to hold both things at once, the need to change and grow, and the need to remember and preserve. These cities have learned that the past is not an obstacle to the future. It is a resource. What would it take to truly reckon with what has been buried? First, it would take acknowledgement, the acknowledgement that something real was lost, that the people who lost it, the displaced communities, the demolished neighborhoods, the erased cultures, were harmed. That the harm was not accidental or inevitable, but was the result of decisions made by people who could have decided differently. Second, it would take investment. The work of recovering buried history is expensive. Archaeological excavation is expensive. Historical research is expensive. The preservation of the physical remains that still exist is expensive. Canada has not, historically, invested in this work at a level commensurate with the scale of what has been lost. Third, it would take a change in the way development decisions are made. The current system, in which development proceeds rapidly and historical investigation is either not done or done too late to influence outcomes, needs to be replaced by a system in which historical significance is considered before development begins, not after it is already underway. Fourth, and most fundamentally, it would take a change in culture. A culture that values newness over oldness, that sees preservation as a luxury for history buffs rather than a necessity for healthy societies, cannot preserve its own history. The culture of Canadian cities has changed somewhat in recent decades. There is more appreciation for historic neighborhoods, more public interest in architectural heritage, more political support for heritage designation. But the change is incomplete and uneven. There is a building in downtown Montreal that has been demolished twice and rebuilt twice. The Bon Secours Market, completed in 1847 on the Bon Secours Street in Old Montreal, is one of the finest examples of neoclassical architecture in Canada. Its silver dome has been a landmark of the Montreal waterfront for over 170 years. It served as Montreal City Hall for a period in the mid-19th century, then as a market, then as a public venue, then as offices. But to call it the same building is, in some sense, to be generous. The building has been restored so many times, and the restorations have been so extensive, that the question of what is original and what is replacement is genuinely complicated. The dome was rebuilt. The interior was gutted and rebuilt. The exterior stonework has been repaired and replaced in sections. The building that stands today is a palimpsest, a surface that has been written on, partially erased, and written on again. Is a palimpsest still authentic? Is a restored building still the original building? And these are not just philosophical questions. They are practical questions that affect how we relate to the past and what we can learn from it. A building that has been completely restored, every stone replaced, every interior element renewed, tells us less about how it was built than a building that has been left to age imperfectly. The marks of time are themselves historical information. The wear patterns on a threshold, the repairs to a roof that show how the building was maintained over generations, the additions and modifications that reveal how needs changed over time. All of this is information that a perfect restoration destroys. The question of what to preserve and how to preserve it is not simply a technical question. It is a question about what we value in our relationship to the past. Let us end where we began. There is a city underneath the city you are walking through right now. If you are in Montreal, beneath the sidewalks of the Plateau Mont-Royal neighborhood, there are the foundations of 19th century buildings whose upper floors were removed when the street level was raised. The inhabitants of those buildings once stepped directly from their front doors onto the street. Now those front doors open into basements. If you were in Toronto, beneath the streets of the waterfront, there is the accumulated fill of 2 centuries of urban development, containing within it the artifacts and remains of the buildings that were demolished to provide that fill. The original shoreline of Lake Ontario, where the town of York began, is somewhere beneath your feet. If you are in Vancouver, beneath the streets of Gastown, there are the remains of the city that burned in 1886. Not many remains because the fire was thorough, but some. The clay that was scorched by the fire, the nails and fragments of hardware that are all that survived of the wooden buildings, the evidence that something was here before what is here now. If you're in Quebec City, you can still see the layers of the city without digging, the walls that the French built and the British modified and the Canadians maintained, the buildings that have stood for 300 years, wearing their age openly, telling their stories in stone. The buried cities of Canada are not gone. They are beneath us. They are behind the walls of our buildings and under the floors of our basements and in the ground under our streets. They are the accumulated history of every person who ever lived on this land, and going back not just to European settlement, but to the Indigenous occupation that preceded it by thousands of years. To reckon with these buried cities is to reckon with who we are. It is to acknowledge that the Canada of today did not spring from nothing. It was built, literally, physically built, on what came before, on the cultures that were here first, on the buildings that were demolished to make room for new ones, on the communities that were displaced to make room for different ones, on the soil itself, which contains within it the evidence of every person who has ever lived and worked and died on this land. The question is not whether this history exists. It does. The question is whether we are willing to look at it. And the answer to that question will determine what kind of country Canada chooses to be. The cities are still being buried. Right now, somewhere in Canada, a building that someone considers ordinary is being demolished to make room for something that someone else considers necessary. The people doing the demolishing may be right. The people mourning the loss may also be right. The truth is that both things can be true at once, that new things are needed, and that old things are worth grieving. The archaeology happening under Canadian cities right now, wherever construction is underway, is uncovering evidence of all the previous versions of those cities. The clay stains where wooden posts once stood, the hearths where fires were built on cold nights that no one living can remember, the buttons and coins and broken ceramics that were the everyday equipment of lives lived before living memory. And these things are being found documented in photographs and field notes and laboratory reports, and then removed or reburied. The construction proceeds. The city continues to build itself. Somewhere under that construction, under the newest layer of the city that is being added right now, is every layer that came before. The 20th century city, the 19th century city, the 18th century city, the Indigenous city that was here before any European ever set foot on this land. All of it is still there, waiting. The question is not whether we can find it. We know it is there. The question is whether we can learn to see it. End. Part 2. The specific places. There are streets in Canada where the ground itself remembers. Walk east along St. Paul Street in Old Montreal on a late afternoon in October, when the tourists have thinned and the light is coming in low from the west, and you can feel it. The buildings press close on both sides, 4 and 5 stories of stone that has been absorbing heat and cold for 150 years or more. The street is narrow because it was laid out before the automobile existed, before anyone imagined a world in which vehicles would need to pass each other in opposite directions at speed. The proportions are human. The stone is local. Limestone from the island of Montreal itself, quarried by workers whose names are not remembered and whose graves are not marked. This street was once the commercial spine of Ville-Marie. The furs that built New France passed through warehouses on this street. The merchants who traded them built houses here, pressed against each other in the French tradition, sharing walls to conserve heat and maximize the value of expensive urban land. Some of those buildings are still here. Not all of them. The fires took many, and the various redevelopments of the 19th century took others. But some. Stand in front of the building at 446 St. Paul Street and look at the stonework around the door. The jambs are worn smooth by 2 centuries of hands. The proportions of the opening belong to a world before standardization, before the era when all doors were the same height and all rooms were the same size. This is what survival looks like. Not perfect preservation, not museum presentation. Survival, the building still standing, still used, still marked by the use it has seen. But around the corner, on the streets that run perpendicular to St. Paul, the story is different. Many of the lots that were once occupied by buildings from the French regime are now parking lots or empty lots or buildings from the 20th century that have none of the character of what they replaced. The streets still run in the same directions. The street plan of Old Montreal has changed relatively little since the 18th century, but the buildings that gave those streets their character are often gone. The archaeology of the fur trade is buried in the ground of Old Montreal in ways that most visitors never suspect. The fur trade was the economic foundation of New France for a century and a half. Every spring, canoes loaded with furs arrived in Montreal from the interior of the continent, traded at the markets and warehouses of the city, and returned with trade goods that would make the next year's hunt possible. On the physical infrastructure of this trade, the warehouses, the wharves, the markets, the houses of the merchants who organized it, was substantial. Some of it has been excavated. The Pointe-a-Calliere Museum sits directly above one of the most intensively excavated archaeological sites in Canada. The museum opened in 1992 on the 350th anniversary of the founding of Montreal, and it was designed from the beginning to incorporate the archaeological remains that had been discovered during its construction. Walking through the museum today, you can stand on glass floors and look down into the excavated layers of the site below you. You can see the foundations of the Calliere House, built in 1695 and named for Louis Hector de Calliere, the governor of New France who lived there. You can see the stone-lined channel of the Little Saint-Pierre River, which once flowed through the site and was gradually covered and eventually buried as the city expanded over it. You can see the remains of the fort that Maisonneuve built in 1642, the original physical expression of the French intention to remain. Below all of that, below the French regime layers, there are the traces of the indigenous occupation that preceded European settlement. Fire-cracked rock, fragments of ceramic, traces of structures that were already ancient when Champlain first sailed up the St. Lawrence. The museum was designed to make all of this visible and accessible, and it succeeds in doing so with remarkable effectiveness. But it is important to understand what the museum represents. It represents the survival of one site, a carefully excavated and preserved, while almost everything around it was developed without the same care. The village of Lequin, now a borough of Montreal, was the starting point of the canoe routes that led into the interior of the continent. It was here that the fur trade voyageurs, the men who paddled the canoes, who carried the goods and the furs over the portages, who spent months and years in the wilderness of the Canadian Shield, began and ended their journeys. The name Lachine, French for China, reflects the early belief that the route west would eventually lead to Asia. It did not, but the name stuck. The Lachine Canal, opened in 1825, bypassed the Lachine Rapids and made it possible for boats to travel from Montreal to the Great Lakes without portaging. The construction of the canal transformed the economy of the region. Mills and factories sprang up along its banks. Workers came from Ireland, from Scotland, from the rural Quebec countryside. A new industrial city grew up alongside the old fur trade village. The archaeological remains of both the fur trade era and the industrial era are present under the soil of Lachine and along the banks of the canal. Some of them have been investigated. The reconstruction of the old Lachine fort, which is now a National Historic Site, involved archaeological work that revealed the original dimensions and construction details of the structure. The excavations along the canal have uncovered artifacts from both the fur trade and the industrial periods. But the canal corridor has also been the site of significant development in recent decades. The closing of the canal to commercial traffic in 1970 was followed by a long period of industrial abandonment, during which the factories and warehouses along the canal fell into disuse and disrepair. When the canal was restored as a recreational waterway in the 1990s and 2000s, the development pressure on the surrounding land was intense. The industrial buildings that remained were converted to condominiums. The vacant lots were developed with new residential construction. The workers who had once populated the canal corridor, and whose communities had given it its social character, were replaced by a different class of resident, one that appreciated the historic character of the canal as an aesthetic backdrop rather than as a living memory. In Kingston, Ontario, the layers of the buried city are particularly visible because the geology of the place has cooperated with preservation in a way that is unusual in Canada. Kingston is built on limestone that outcrops along the shore of Lake Ontario, that was quarried from the land immediately behind the shoreline that was used to build the city's earliest substantial structures. The result is that Kingston has more surviving limestone architecture from the early 19th century than any other city in Canada. The houses along King Street, the government buildings along the waterfront, the churches that were built in the first decades of the 19th century, all of them are limestone, and limestone, unlike brick, does not absorb water in the same way. It does not spall and erode in the freeze-thaw cycle with the same speed. It endures. The military character of Kingston also contributed to the survival of its historic architecture. Fort Henry, built between 1832 and 1836 to defend the entrance to the Rideau Canal, is one of the best preserved British military fortifications in North America. The stone structures of the fort, built with military thoroughness and maintained with military discipline, have survived with remarkable completeness. But Kingston is also a city that has buried parts of itself. The waterfront that existed in the early 19th century, the working waterfront of wharves and warehouses, and the small businesses that served the lake trade, has been substantially transformed. The highway that runs along the waterfront, built in the 20th century to carry automobile traffic, and cut the city off from the lake in a way that was common to the planning of that era. The area behind the historic waterfront has seen demolition of historic buildings. The residential neighborhoods that housed the workers of the 19th century city have been gradually replaced by institutional uses. The expanding campus of Queen's University, the Royal Military College, that have a different relationship to the built heritage of the city. The town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, at the mouth of the Niagara River on Lake Ontario, is another of those Ontario communities that survived economically unchanged long enough to preserve an unusual concentration of historic architecture. It was the first capital of Upper Canada before York, later Toronto, assumed that role. The legislative buildings that once housed the government of the province were here, on the main street of a town that was then known as Newark. Those buildings are gone, burned by American forces during the War of 1812. The town was burned to the ground in December 1813, and the legislative buildings burned with it. What was rebuilt after 1813 is still largely standing. The War of 1812 created, paradoxically, a moment of architectural coherence in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Because the entire town was rebuilt in a relatively short period after the war, the surviving buildings share a visual character that reflects the tastes and means of the early 19th century in Upper Canada. Modest Georgian and federal-style houses, simple commercial buildings, a courthouse and jail that still stand on the main street. The survival of this architectural character is the result of the same economic logic that preserved Port Hope. Niagara-on-the-Lake did not grow much in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, so the buildings from the early period were not replaced. The wine industry and the tourist trade that have developed in the Niagara Peninsula in recent decades have brought prosperity, but prosperity has come late enough that it has been channeled into restoration and compatible new construction rather than wholesale replacement. Niagara-on-the-Lake is now one of the most visited heritage destinations in Ontario. The preservation of its historic character is both genuine and managed. The buildings are real and old. The character of the place is also, to some extent, maintained for the benefit of visitors rather than evolved from the daily life of its residents. This is the perpetual tension of heritage tourism. The preservation that tourism makes economically possible can also freeze a place in a version of itself that serves the visitor rather than the resident. In the West, the archaeology of the buried city takes different forms. Calgary was founded in 1875 as a Northwest Mounted Police post at the confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers. It was incorporated as a town in 1884 and as a city in 1894. The oil that would transform it into one of the wealthiest cities in Canada was not discovered nearby until 1914, and the major oil boom did not come until after World War II. The Calgary that existed before oil is largely gone. The small prairie city of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with its wooden commercial buildings and modest residential neighborhoods, was demolished systematically as oil money poured in. The downtown core was rebuilt not once but several times, each wave of oil prosperity bringing a new generation of towers that replaced the previous generation. The Eau Claire neighborhood, immediately north of downtown Calgary along the Bow River, was one of the original settlement areas of the city. It was the site of sawmills that processed the timber floated down from the mountains, of the immigrant communities that settled along the river, of the working-class character that Calgary once had before oil transformed it into a corporate city. Almost nothing of that original Eau Claire survives. The area has been redeveloped multiple times. The sawmills are gone. The workers' housing is gone. The physical evidence of Calgary's pre-oil past is so sparse that historians working on the 19th century history of the city must rely heavily on documents and photographs rather than physical remains. But the land remembers in other ways. The archaeology that has been done along the Bow River corridor has revealed evidence of Indigenous occupation going back thousands of years. The confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers was a significant gathering place for the peoples of the plains long before any European arrived. The archaeological record of that occupation, preserved in the riverbank deposits and the midden sites along the shore, is one of the most complete records of pre-contact plains archaeology in Canada. Edmonton's buried history is different from Calgary's, partly because Edmonton's growth has been somewhat less explosive. Edmonton sits on the North Saskatchewan River, at a point where the river is navigable and where the valley provides both shelter and a connection to the interior of the continent. It was a Hudson's Bay Company post from 1795, established as Fort Edmonton on the south bank of the river, and serving as a major node in the fur trade network of the Northwest. The fort itself has been reconstructed on the south bank of the river as Fort Edmonton Park, a living history site that attempts to recreate the physical character of the Hudson's Bay Company era. The reconstruction is based on historical photographs and documentary evidence. It is, in the truest sense, a reproduction, not the original fort, which was demolished long ago, but an interpretation of what it might have looked like. Below the reconstruction, beneath the soil of the river valley, the actual archaeological remains of the original fort are present. They have been partially investigated, but not fully. The complexity of the archaeological record at a site that was occupied for nearly a century means that excavation is slow and careful work. The Edmonton River Valley itself is one of the great assets of the city, a green corridor that runs through the urban area and preserves something of the pre-urban landscape. But the valley is also a contested space. Development pressure on the valley rim has been constant, and the buildings that have been allowed to be constructed at the edge of the valley have not always been sympathetic to the landscape. At the history of the valley, the indigenous use of the river corridor, the fur trade era, the early settlement period, is buried in the valley walls and the river deposits. It is a history that is still being excavated, still being understood. The archaeology of the CPR camps is one of the great untold stories of Canadian history. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway across the mountains and through the prairies in the early 1880s required a workforce of thousands. Chinese laborers, recruited through contractors in British Columbia and California, did much of the most dangerous work: the blasting of tunnels, the cutting of rock faces, the building of trestle bridges across mountain valleys. The camps where these workers lived were entirely temporary. They moved with the railroad, established, occupied, abandoned. When the work moved on, the camp was left to the elements. The wooden structures rotted or burned. The garbage pits were covered by vegetation. The graves, and there were graves, hundreds of them, because the work was dangerous and the medical care was minimal, were often unmarked. The mortality rate among Chinese workers on the CPR has been estimated at 1 death per kilometer of track through the mountains. That estimate may be conservative. The men who died were recorded imperfectly, if at all, in the records of the companies that employed them. Their names were often rendered phonetically and incorrectly by English-speaking clerks. Their burial locations were not marked in any systematic way. In recent years, archaeologists and community historians have begun to systematically investigate the sites of CPR construction camps. The work has produced remarkable results. The material culture of the camps, the artifacts of daily life among men who were far from home and working in conditions of extreme hardship, tells a story about the Chinese-Canadian experience in the 19th century that documents alone could never tell. The ceramics found in campsites are particularly informative. Chinese workers ate familiar food when they could obtain it, and they used familiar pottery. The presence of Chinese-manufactured ceramics in CPR campsites, far from any Chinese community, tells you something about the supply networks that connected these isolated workers to their cultural home. It also tells you something about the ways in which men who had been transported to an alien landscape tried to maintain their own identity and culture in the face of enormous pressure to abandon both. The graves of the Chinese CPR workers are a particular kind of buried history. Some were buried in Chinese cemeteries, where communities maintained them until the practice of repatriation, sending bones back to China, was interrupted by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923 and by subsequent political changes. Some were buried in plots allocated to Chinese workers in non-Chinese cemeteries, where they were segregated in death as they had been segregated in life. Many were simply buried where they died, in the mountain passes, in the river valleys, in the places where the work was so far from any town that there was no alternative. And these graves are being found. The archaeologists working on CPR campsites sometimes find them, marked only by slight depressions in the ground and the presence of artifacts that indicate Chinese cultural practices of burial. Community historians, working with the families of the workers, are trying to identify and document the locations of as many graves as possible. The work is driven by a sense of obligation. The men who built the railway were not acknowledged in their own time. They were excluded from the photograph taken at Craigellachie when the last spike was driven on November 7th, 1885. They were explicitly excluded from Canadian citizenship by the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, which imposed a head tax on Chinese immigrants. They were erased from the public memory of the CPR's construction in a way that was deliberate and systematic. The recovery of their graves, the documentation of their camps, the telling of their stories, this is not just historical work. It is a form of acknowledgement, an acknowledgement that these men were here, that their labor built something, and that their deaths were real and should be remembered. In the prairies, the buried architecture includes something that is not always recognized as architecture at all, the physical marks that homesteading left on the landscape. The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 opened the prairies to homesteading on a grid system. The grid was surveyed without reference to the existing landscape. The rivers, the hills, the patches of woodland, the wetlands. It was imposed on the land with mathematical indifference to what was already there. The homesteaders who came from Ontario and Quebec, from Britain, from the United States, from Ukraine and Poland and Germany and Scandinavia, built on this grid. They built farmhouses and barns and granaries. They dug wells and planted orchards. They established communities, churches, schools, post offices that served the farms that surrounded them. Many of those communities are gone now. The consolidation of farming in the 20th century, the mechanization that reduced the need for farm labor, the migration of young people from rural areas to cities, all of these forces combined to depopulate the prairies at the same time that they were being settled. Towns that were once significant centers of community, life, are now ghost towns. Their streets empty, their buildings collapsing, their graveyards the only remnant of the community that once gave them meaning. The Ukrainian bloc settlements of East Central Alberta are a particular example. The communities that Ukrainian immigrants established there in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were remarkable for their density and their cultural coherence. Churches with distinctive Byzantine domes, community halls, schools, the physical infrastructure of a transplanted culture. Some of these communities survive, others are preserved as heritage sites. Many are gone, their buildings collapsed or burned, their streets grassed over. The only evidence of their existence, the cemetery on the edge of town, where the names on the stones tell you who was here. The story of what was buried is also the story of what was built on top. The cities of Canada that emerged from all of this demolition and rebuilding are, by any measure, remarkable achievements. They are clean and livable, and by global standards, extraordinarily safe and prosperous. The infrastructure of water and sanitation and electricity and communication that underlies them represents an immense investment of human intelligence and effort. But they are also cities that have, in many cases, lost the sense of depth that comes from being in a place that has been inhabited for a long time. They feel new because in many ways they are new. The buildings you see in most Canadian downtowns were built within the last century, many within the last few decades. The streets you walk are not old streets in old ruts. They are recent constructions, engineered for the automobile, oriented to the needs of a mobile society that does not linger in one place for long. This newness is both a freedom and a loss. The freedom is real. There is something liberating about a city that is not weighed down by its past, that feels open to reinvention and change. But the loss is also real. The sense of deep-rootedness, of being in a place that remembers many things, that has been shaped by many hands over many generations. This is something that the buried cities of Canada cannot provide to the cities that were built on top of them, unless those buried cities are, in some sense, recovered. The recovery is happening. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. In Winnipeg, the Exchange District, a neighborhood of late 19th and early 20th century. Commercial buildings that once housed the grain trade that made Winnipeg the economic capital of the prairies has been designated a National Historic Site and is being gradually revitalized. The buildings are old and their preservation is not always economically easy, but the neighborhood has developed a character and a life that newer areas of the city lack. In Halifax, the waterfront development of the last few decades has tried, with mixed success, to maintain the connection between the historic fabric of the city and the modern uses that the waterfront area needs to support. The historic properties, a group of early 19th century warehouses on the waterfront, have been adapted for contemporary use while maintaining their historic character. In Victoria, British Columbia, the inner harbor has been remarkably preserved. The Empress Hotel, built in 1908 in the chateau-esque style that the CPR favored for its destination properties, still dominates the waterfront. The legislative buildings, completed in 1897 and still in use, anchor the south end of the harbor. The relationship between these buildings and the water is still legible. You can still understand why this particular harbor was where British Columbia's colonial capital was established. In the smaller cities and towns of Canada, in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, with its remarkable survival of 18th and 19th century architecture, in Ste-Anne-de-Beaupré, Quebec, where the Pilgrimage Church has anchored a community for centuries, in Barkerville, British Columbia, on where the Gold Rush town has been preserved almost in its entirety as a living history site, the buried history is not buried at all. It is visible, accessible, and in many cases still alive. The people who kept these places are worth naming. The women and men who noticed that something important was disappearing and decided to do something about it. The amateur historians who documented buildings before the bulldozers arrived. The photographers who went out on cold Sunday mornings to record the facades of buildings that most people passed without a second glance. The community organizers who fought City Hall and sometimes won. The architects who argued that old buildings were not merely old, but were also beautiful and irreplaceable and worth the expense of maintaining. These people were not always successful. The buildings they fought to preserve were not always saved. The campaigns they waged were not always won. But the work they did, the documentation, the advocacy, the building of the case for preservation, changed the culture in ways that are still bearing fruit. The heritage preservation movement in Canada today is not primarily a movement of professional historians and architects, though professionals play an important role in it. It is primarily a movement of ordinary citizens who have decided that where they live matters, that the history embedded in their physical environment is worth understanding and protecting, and that the cities and towns they inhabit will be better places if they can maintain a connection to the places they have been. And what of the places where there is nothing left to preserve? What of the communities that were demolished so completely that there is not a single building standing, not a single street left in its original configuration, nothing that a visitor could point to and say, here is what was here before? These places exist too. The neighborhood that is now a parking lot, the historic district that is now a highway, the Indigenous village site that is now a subdivision. In these places, the buried history is truly buried, accessible only through archaeology or documents or the memories of the people who live there. In these places, the work of recovery takes a different form. It is not the preservation of physical fabric. It is the preservation of memory. The oral histories of the people who were displaced. The photographs that were taken before the demolition. The maps that show the original street patterns. The names of the streets that are now gone. This kind of preservation is not less important than the preservation of buildings. In some ways, it is more important because it is the only form of preservation that is possible once the buildings are gone. The communities that were demolished, the people who were displaced, the cultures that were suppressed, their histories deserve to be told, not just for the sake of the past, but for the sake of the present. Because a society that does not know what it has demolished, what it has erased, what it has buried, cannot make honest decisions about what it should do next. Canada is still making decisions about what to bury and what to keep. Every day, somewhere in this country, a building that someone considers historic is being evaluated for demolition. A neighborhood that someone considers significant is being reviewed for redevelopment. A community that someone considers ordinary is facing changes that will alter its character permanently. The decisions that are being made today will be the buried history of tomorrow. The buildings that are demolished in this decade will be the lost architecture that historians mourn in the next decade and the one after that. We know this. We have seen it happen enough times to know that we will regret what we demolish, that we will look back at the photographs of what stood here before and wonder why we let it go. And yet, the demolitions continue because the needs are real, because the pressures are real, because the economic logic of development is powerful and the economic logic of preservation is often fragile. The question that this history asks is not whether we can stop all demolitions. We cannot, and in many cases we should not try. The question is whether we can become more conscious, more deliberate, more honest about what we are doing when we demolish. Whether we can acknowledge that every building that falls carries with it a piece of the accumulated memory of the people who built and used and inhabited it. Whether we can develop a culture that treats that memory as something worth considering before the decision is made, not just something worth mourning after it is gone. The cities of Canada are built on layers of history that most of us cannot see, but the layers are there, beneath the concrete and the asphalt, and beneath the foundations of the newest buildings, beneath the streets and the subway tunnels and the underground malls. The accumulated evidence of every person who has ever lived on this land is present, waiting. The work of recovering that evidence is the work of understanding who we are. It is the work of acknowledging the full complexity of Canadian history, not just the triumphs and achievements, but also the losses and the erasures and the choices that were made at the expense of people who had no power to resist them. It is slow work. It is expensive work. It is work that is never complete, because new layers are always being added while old layers are being uncovered. But it is necessary work, because a country that does not know what it has buried cannot honestly face what it still has. And a country that does not honestly face what it still has cannot make wise decisions about what to build next. The ground beneath Canada's cities is full of history. The question is whether we have the patience to look at it. And Part 3, The People Who Remembered. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from losing a place. It is different from the grief of losing a person, though it shares some of the same qualities. The sense that something irreplaceable is gone. The way the absence keeps surprising you. You turn a corner expecting to see a building that is no longer there, and for a moment the emptiness is startling, almost physical. Planners and developers who have pushed forward demolitions in Canadian cities have sometimes been surprised by the intensity of the grief that follows, and they built something new, something better by almost any measurable standard, more efficient, more modern, more accessible. And yet the people who had lived in proximity to what was demolished mourned as if a person had died. This is not irrationality. It is a recognition that places carry meaning in ways that are not captured by any square footage, calculation, or cost-benefit analysis. The building on the corner was not just a building. It was the place where your grandfather worked, where your mother went to school, where the neighborhood gathered for 50 years of winters and summers and ordinary days that seemed ordinary at the time and seem irreplaceable now. The loss of architectural heritage is not only a cultural loss in the abstract, it is a personal loss for the people who lived in proximity to what was lost. George Rusty I was a Toronto lawyer who spent decades fighting to preserve the architecture of his city. In the 1970s and 1980s, when development pressure on Toronto's older neighborhoods was intense, Rusty I became one of the most effective advocates for heritage preservation in the city. He understood both the legal mechanisms and the cultural arguments, and he was able to deploy both with precision. He helped save buildings, he helped change policies, he helped build the institutional framework that made heritage preservation in Toronto more systematic and more effective. He was not always successful. There are buildings in Toronto that were demolished despite his best efforts. The grief of those losses was something he carried, but the buildings that were saved because of his work, and there are many of them, stand as evidence that individual effort matters, that one person with the right knowledge and the right commitment can change outcomes that seemed inevitable. The same is true of Jane Jacobs, who was perhaps the most influential advocate for the value of old buildings and old neighborhoods that North America has produced in the 20th century. Jacobs moved to Toronto from New York in 1968, partly to escape the Vietnam War. Her sons faced conscription, and partly because Toronto offered the kind of urban environment she valued. She settled in the Annex neighborhood, a collection of late Victorian houses just west of the University of Toronto that was, in the 1960s, under development pressure. She applied to Toronto the same insights she had developed writing about New York in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961. The argument of that book, that old buildings provide economic and social functions that new buildings cannot replicate, that the mixed-use, fine-grained urban environments of old neighborhoods create conditions for human flourishing, that the planned environments of modernism destroy, was as applicable to Toronto as it was to New York. Jacobs became deeply involved in Toronto's planning debates. She argued against the Spadina Expressway, the planned highway that would have cut through some of the city's most significant residential neighborhoods. The Spadina fight became one of the defining moments of urban activism in Canadian history, and the expressway was stopped, largely because of the sustained community opposition that Jacobs helped to organize and articulate. The neighborhoods that were saved from the Spadina Expressway, the Annex, Yorkville, the western reaches of the downtown, are now among the most valued and expensive real estate in Toronto. Their historic character, which was nearly destroyed in the name of vehicular mobility, has become one of their defining assets. In Quebec, the preservation of French-Canadian architectural heritage has had a political dimension that goes beyond the usual heritage debates. The distinctive architecture of rural Quebec, the fieldstone farmhouses, the wooden churches with their silver-painted roofs, the covered bridges, the wayside crosses, is not just historic. For many Quebecers, It is a physical expression of cultural identity. The preservation of these structures is understood not only as a matter of historical interest, but as an affirmation of the survival and continuity of French-Canadian culture. This political dimension has sometimes helped preservation efforts by mobilizing support that purely historical arguments might not generate. When a fieldstone farmhouse in the Laurentians is threatened with demolition, the argument for its preservation can draw on cultural identity in ways that a similar argument for an Ontario farmhouse cannot. But the political dimension has also complicated preservation efforts in Quebec in ways that are not always acknowledged. The emphasis on the pre-conquest French-Canadian architectural tradition has sometimes led to a relative neglect of the English-Canadian and immigrant architectural heritage of Quebec. The eastern townships, where a distinct Anglo-Protestant culture established itself in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, has significant architectural heritage that does not fit the dominant narrative of Quebec identity and has accordingly received less attention and support. The industrial heritage of Montreal, which reflects the period of English-speaking commercial dominance in the 19th century, has been similarly contested. Who owns this heritage? The descendants of the Scots and English merchants who built those warehouses and factories? The Francophone workers who labored in them? The immigrant communities who settled in the neighborhoods around them? The answer, of course, is that the heritage belongs to all of them. But the politics of Quebec's past have sometimes made it difficult to articulate that answer clearly. The relationship between heritage preservation and gentrification is one of the most uncomfortable conversations in Canadian urban life. It is uncomfortable because it reveals a tension between two things that most people would, in the abstract, support: the preservation of historic urban fabric and the survival of the communities that gave that fabric its meaning. The neighborhoods of Canadian cities that have been most successfully preserved in physical terms, Gastown in Vancouver, the Distillery District in Toronto, Old Strathcona in Edmonton, are also neighborhoods that have experienced intense gentrification. The preservation of the buildings was accompanied, or in some cases preceded, by a shift in the population. The working class and immigrant communities that originally inhabited these neighborhoods were replaced by wealthier residents who could afford the rents that historic buildings, once preserved and renovated, command. Is this a failure of preservation, or is it an inevitable consequence of it? If you make a neighborhood desirable by preserving its historic character, you will attract people with the money to pay for desirability, and those people will displace the people who are already there. This is not a Canadian problem alone. It is a problem in every city in the world that has gone through the cycle of heritage preservation followed by gentrification, but it has a particular character in Canada, because the communities that are most often displaced by gentrification are the communities that are already most marginalized: Indigenous people, Black Canadians, recent immigrants, the working poor. The preservation of historic architecture, if it is not accompanied by serious policies to protect the economic security of the people who live in the areas being preserved, can actually make inequality worse. It can make beautiful neighborhoods that poor people can no longer afford to live in, while those same poor people are pushed to the periphery of cities with less access to services, jobs, and the social networks that allow people to thrive. A heritage preservation movement that does not grapple seriously with this problem is not, in the end, a movement for the preservation of culture. It is a movement for the preservation of aesthetics. And aesthetics, however important, are not the same as culture. The Distillery District in Toronto deserves extended consideration because it illustrates both the best and the worst of what heritage preservation in Canada has become. The Gooderham and Worts Distillery Complex at the eastern edge of downtown Toronto was established in the 1830s and grew into one of the largest distillery operations in the British Empire. By the mid-19th century, it was producing enormous quantities of whiskey, beer, and other products, employing hundreds of workers and contributing substantially to the economy of the young city. The buildings that housed this operation were built in brick, in the Victorian industrial style that valued solidity and functionality. Red brick, a heavy timber framing, large windows to admit the light needed for the work inside. The complex grew over decades, adding buildings as the operation expanded, so that the ensemble that survives today reflects the accumulated growth of nearly a century of industrial activity. The distillery closed in 1990. The complex sat vacant for over a decade, deteriorating slowly in the way that large industrial buildings do when they are not maintained. Then, in the early 2000s, the buildings were designated as a heritage conservation district, and the site was redeveloped as an arts and entertainment complex. The redevelopment was, by many measures, a success. The buildings were preserved. The brick and timber were cleaned and repaired. The industrial character of the spaces was maintained rather than obliterated. The site became a center for galleries, restaurants, shops, and cultural events that brought new life to an area that had been dead for over a decade. But the distillery district today is a place that has nothing to do with whiskey or with the workers who made it. It is a place for the consumption of artisanal goods and experiences by people who have the money to pay for them. The relationship between the preserved industrial architecture and the actual industrial history it represents is essentially decorative. The buildings are used as a backdrop, a setting, a source of aesthetic interest, rather than as a living connection to the working class history they embody. The workers who built those buildings and labored in them for generations are not part of the story that the distillery district tells about itself. When their history, the labor organizing, the industrial accidents, the struggle to make a living wage, the communities that formed around the shared experience of factory work, is not commemorated, not displayed, not made part of the visitor experience. The architecture survived. The history it was meant to tell did not. There is a different model of heritage preservation emerging in some parts of Canada, one that tries to address the disconnection between the preservation of physical fabric and the preservation of social meaning. In Winnipeg's North End, the efforts to preserve and revitalize the historic built environment of the neighborhood have been explicitly connected to efforts to support the communities that have always lived there. And Indigenous-led housing organizations are working to rehabilitate historic buildings for use by Indigenous families at below-market rents. Cultural organizations are using historic community halls and churches to provide programming that serves the current residents of the neighborhood, rather than attracting visitors from outside it. The North End of Winnipeg is not a pretty story in many respects. It is a neighborhood that has faced disinvestment, crime, poverty, and the accumulated effects of generations of systemic discrimination against Indigenous and immigrant communities. The historic buildings that survive there are not well maintained. Many of them are in poor condition, but they are being preserved by and for the people who live in the neighborhood. The preservation is not aesthetic. It is practical. It is an act of community self-determination, of the decision to maintain a physical presence in a neighborhood that others have written off, to keep the building standing as evidence that the community is still here. This kind of preservation is harder to photograph for a tourism brochure. It is harder to show to a visiting dignitary as an example of what heritage preservation can accomplish. But it is, in many ways, more faithful to the actual purpose of heritage preservation. Maintaining the connection between a community and its physical environment so that the accumulated memory of that environment can continue to be a resource for the community that lives in it. What does Canada owe its buried cities? The question is not merely philosophical. It has practical implications. It implies, first, that Canada owes more systematic documentation of what has been lost. The historical record of demolished buildings, cleared neighborhoods, displaced communities is incomplete and uneven. Some cities have done better than others. Toronto has a relatively good photographic record of demolished buildings, partly because of the work of photographers like William James, who systematically documented the city's architecture in the early 20th century. Montreal has the extensive documentation of the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Other cities are less well served. The investment needed to properly document what exists before it is gone, to create the kind of systematic architectural inventory that would make future generations' understanding of the current era more complete, is substantial, but it is a fraction of the cost of what is lost when a building comes down without documentation. It implies, second, that Canada owes a more honest account of who made the decisions that led to the demolition of communities. The urban renewal programs of the mid-20th century were not acts of nature. They were political decisions made by politicians and bureaucrats and developers who were serving particular interests. Those interests were not the interests of the people who were displaced. Acknowledging this does not require a simple assignment of blame. The context of those decisions was complex, the motivations of those who made them were mixed, and the understanding of urban planning that prevailed at the time was genuinely different from the understanding that prevails today. But acknowledging the decisions and acknowledging who paid the price for them is a necessary part of the accounting. It implies, third, that Canada owes reparative investment in the communities that were most damaged by those decisions. The communities that were displaced by urban renewal, that were cleared for highways and housing projects, that were demolished without compensation or consultation, have not recovered. The social and economic damage that was done to those communities in the 1950s and 1960s is still visible and still consequential. The physical rebuilding of those communities, the creation of affordable housing in the areas from which people were displaced, the investment in the physical and social infrastructure that would allow those communities to reestablish themselves, is expensive and politically difficult. But it is what acknowledgement of historical harm actually requires. Let us end with a specific image. In the city of Halifax, on a hill above the harbor, there is a viewpoint from which you can see the whole story of what this document has been trying to tell. Looking south and east, you can see the historic waterfront, with its blocks of stone warehouses from the early 19th century, and beyond them the harbor, still working, still important, still defining the character of the city. Looking north, you can see where Africville was. The site is now a park, with a reconstructed church that stands on approximately the site of the original Seaview United Baptist Church. The park is well maintained. The view from it is beautiful, but the community is not there. The people are not there. The buildings are not there. Looking west, you can see the hospital complex that now occupies much of the area that was once the working-class residential neighborhood of the North End. The buildings of the hospital are modern and functional. The streets that once ran through the neighborhood are gone. The houses where people lived are gone. Looking up, you can see the Citadel, the British fortification that has dominated the skyline of Halifax since it was completed in the 1850s. The Citadel survived because it served a military function that the government wished to maintain, and because the government that owned it eventually recognized its historic value. It is now a National Historic Site, carefully maintained, open to visitors. The Citadel is the oldest surviving architectural landmark in Halifax. The communities that surrounded it, the neighborhoods that gave it context, the social fabric that made it part of a living city rather than an isolated monument, much of that is gone. The citadel stands, the communities are buried. This is the story of Canadian architecture, and it is a story that is not yet finished.